But now you guys understand a little bit about mitosis, meiosis, how meiosis is really important and how mitosis is really important in the inheriting of DNA, right? And what we code in our DNA is mostly proteins, right? And the control of protein production, as you'll see when you get into molecular biology and cell biology. And those proteins are what run the everyday activities of cells and also start giving cells, tissues, their organizational three-dimensional shape and giving us what we call phenotypes, right? Now what evolution does is work on those phenotypes in the natural world. The way I like to think of evolution, at least in the simplest form, natural selection, is the environment is basically bombarding phenotypes throughout the life history of a population of an organism. And what that's going to lead to is those with better adaptations are the ones that are going to live, right? And when you start looking at this, you can actually, like we saw in the case study yesterday, actually see it real time, what we call microevolution. Now, macroevolution, where you're looking at a tree like this and you're looking at different, fossils that gave rise to the modern horse, basically that's called macroevolution, which happens over a much longer period of time and involves the accumulation of all those little changes, right? All those bombardments that those organisms underwent over millions or hundreds of millions of years. The mechanism, right? That in biology, you need a mechanism, right? A mechanism you can test experimentally, hypothesis, variables, holding experimental design consistent, was given to us by this guy who's the godfather, if you will, of evolution, who is Charles Darwin. And then another scientist named Alfred Wallace also is given credit for what is now known as the theory of evolution. There are hundreds of thousands of studies that provide really concrete evidence that this process works, and it works all the time in the natural world. And really, it's common sense, right? So I assume all of you have talked a little bit about evolution in high school, right? Different teachers teach it in different ways. A lot of high school biology classes have compromised and kind of mixed creationism with evolution. And it just doesn't work very well as far as the scientific basis of evolution. Because remember, science can't test for supernatural things like God. I mean, whether you believe in God or not, I have strong faith. I believe in God. I go to church, but I don't practice science on God because I'm not worthy anyway, right? I mean, you can't touch him or her or whoever God is with any scientific method that we know of, at least right now. So we're going to stick to the science and trying to understand how organisms change over time. And that's the simple definition I want to get stuck in your head right now. Evolution is simply organisms changing over time or from generation to generation. We're going to see that at the phenotype level, what you look like, but that's also changing the genotypes, right? Because remember, genotype is what depicts, or what the outcome of your genotype, your alleles, if you're diploid, is your phenotype. Now, if you struggle with this, because it's hard to kind of get in your head and where you could put it on paper or throw it up, then I really suggest going out and reading the chapter in Campbell. This is the chapter that's in the Campbell texts that are in the Cell Lounge. It's a great chapter. It keeps it simple. You don't have to read the whole chapter because we're not going to cover the whole chapter, but you'll be able to pick the parts of the chapter we cover. And you can fill in your notes that way and ask questions as we go along. So what did Darwin do? So Darwin, pretty interesting guy. He was a very smart guy, obviously, very, very interesting guy, but he really didn't do any experiments. He simply was hired in the 1830s to travel the world. What a lucky guy. On a boat, well, unless you don't like boats, to collect specimens. That was his job. I mean, that's like my dream job. Except I would collect photos of specimens mostly, not specimens. But his job was to be part of this expedition that went all over the world, and his job was to collect fossils and all of the species he could and make tremendous documentation and observation on everything that he collected. And that is one thing he was really good at. He was very meticulous in his note-taking and in the specimen collection. And he was influenced by a bunch of scientists at this time that were doing some pretty incredible stuff as far as foundational work for their branches of science, if you will. Okay? And he was an educated man, an avid nerd, all right, and he did a lot of reading. So there are a number of scientists that are listed up here that we'll kind of mention along the way that are major influences on Darwin's thinking as he's collecting all of these specimens and spending time contemplating what he's seeing. Because he's seeing things he's never seen before. He's seeing things nobody's ever seen before. And he's describing them and how they behave. And as he's doing this in his notebooks, he's got, they got all these notebooks of his. He's actually putting together in his mind kind of the way or mechanism that evolution works. So a couple of guys that are important here, start with Linnaeus and go all the way down. We're going to mention these guys as we go along, but a lot of them aren't biologists. A lot of them are geologists or mathematicians, or they study populations. They have more societal effects, but their concepts can be applied directly to Darwin's thinking. So this is kind of the timeline. The only date I'll ever test you on is the actual date of publication of The Origin of Species. I just feel like every biologist should know that. It's 1859 is the date that was published. This is when Darwin actually published The Origin of Species. What I want you to notice is look at the difference in when he collected and began his notebooks back in the 1830s. It was 20 years later when he decided to publish it. There's a reason for that. We'll talk about it when we start talking about him. So that gives you some idea of at least the timeline. And we're going to talk about these fellas up here who are influential in his thinking. So before we start talking about evolution, what are the early ideas? The early ideas of evolution, particularly early on with Aristotle and some of his colleagues later, and at least Greek philosophy, it's more philosophical, but they give this kind of ladder effect to life. That life starts off really primitive and gets more and more complicated, and it's very directional. It goes up to humans, right? So everything is moving to the human form, the human mind, right? It's kind of like the biblical version of this, where creationists start mixing in the idea that, evolution is pretty neat, and maybe we can just combine the Bible on that and say God allowed evolution to happen so we could get humans, right? We have no idea if that's true or not. The only thing that we can study is what actually happens naturally on the planet, and this ladder effect from a mass of cells to humans is obviously not the way evolution works, right? It's not that directional, if you will. But this went, basically around as the belief of how, the diversity of what animals you saw in Europe were there is because of this ladder effect for over, 2,000 years. When the church, the Catholic Church in particular, became a powerful entity both socially, economically, and governmentally, and they started controlling science, that's when this, at least the early versions of creationism arose. And so the loose view is very compatible with evolution, that God created all organisms, and those organisms all look different because God lets them fit in a particular place, so you're combining kind of the science with the religious view. The stricter view, the biblical view, is cut and dry, right? All organisms were created at the same time, a few thousand years ago, and they haven't changed. The ones that are dead, and the ones that are alive, right? The ones that died, that are fossilized, probably died on Noah's, because they didn't make it onto Noah's Ark, right? So none of the dinosaurs. Of course, no. Why would Noah want to take a T-Rex onto the Ark, right? When you eat everybody. But not even the cute dinosaurs. I mean, come on, right? Why aren't they on there, right? So the biblical version has some problems, right?
Is that supposed to be Noah's Ark?
Yeah, it's supposed to. I just found a picture out on the web. And then there's the creation story, right? The earth was created in 7 days, right? And a lot of very strict or very conservative, liberal, depending on how you think of them, religious people even give you a date and time, right? 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, and obviously, that's nowhere in the Bible. This is what Darwin believed when he started his trip. He's a very religious guy, very devout Catholic. So this is how he was raised. Also taught in a more loose form by Plato and Aristotle later in their lives. So why evolutionary thought all of a sudden in this, starting in the 1600s, 1700s and moving into the 1800s? Most of this was triggered by the popular and curious things that explorers were bringing back from Western exotic lands. When I say Western lands, I'm talking about North America, Central America, and South America. All right. So as Europeans started exploring, right, jumping on boats and making that big trip across the Atlantic, they ran into these new land masses that had animals and plants they had never seen before, right? And so this huge spike in biodiversity happens. And they start bringing this stuff back to Europe. So these really exotic animals like, jaguars and leopards and tapirs and all of these exotic foods, right, that weren't in Europe at that time, that were being raised by natives in Central, South, and North America. And so where does all this biodiversity come from? Does it follow the same laws of being fixed? Did it arise at the same time that all of the organisms arose on Europe? Those are the kinds of questions that people were starting to ask and to doubt. The other cool thing about this is geologists and scientists at that time started traveling with these things, with these groups, like Darwin did, right? As you move into the 17 and 1800s. That includes geologists also, not just biologists like Darwin. And geologists were fascinated by collecting fossils on all of the continents, particularly the new ones, right? Like Central and South America and North America. And what they started to see, which is very interesting, is that the fossils that they've found in Africa and India and Europe, they're also in South America and Central America and North America. How is that possible? There's a huge ocean between them, right? I mean, there's no way these animals, when they were alive, could have traveled or swam the Atlantic Ocean, right? Or the Pacific Ocean to get to a landmass. And so that led, a geologist and other scientists to start thinking that at one time, all of the continents were close to each other, if not connected. And if you look at them, they're like puzzle pieces. They kind of fit together into a big, huge landmass that's called Pangea, right? When at least the last time it was together. These continents have floated apart, all right, and they're coming back together. And so, 500 million years from now, they might come back together as one big landmass. And if you think about this, that makes this nice. So you can start, actually, based on fossil findings, kind of see the pattern of migration, if you will, from one continent to another when you put the puzzle pieces really close together. Small straits or small, distances between continents could have been swam or floated upon by animals, or the changing of drought versus rainy seasons could have created land bridges, right, that allowed organisms to move from continent to continent. And so this idea of what's now called biogeography came out about how animals migrate not only across continent to continent, but how animals are distributed within more regional areas, more local areas, like Indiana, right? There is biogeographical data that tells you there are certain lizards found in the northwestern part of the state that you don't see down here in Indianapolis, or even as you go further south. That's what I mean by bio, the biome, biology, organisms, and geography. So it's a really cool area of study that's, very hot right now because of trying to save biodiversity, right? So it ties really nicely into biodiversity. A couple of very important scientists that have affected the way Darwin and evolutionary biologists think. One of them is called, his name's Cuvier, Georges Cuvier. He came up or proposed this concept of catastrophicism, which is basically that catastrophic events have shaped the face of the earth over its history. Huge volcanoes, large multiple asteroids, earthquakes, tsunamis, those types of things. These huge, environmental events have completely changed and altered the surface of the earth. And some of these volcanoes that have erupted over the, at least the evidence of them over Earth's history, were absolutely humongous volcanoes that arose as mountains and spewed tons of minerals, dust, and debris into the atmosphere. Large asteroids that hit the planet, if they're big enough, can throw debris into the atmosphere that can cause pretty much the same events of a nuclear winter, right? Where it blocks out the sun for 50, 60, 80 years and really affects plant life either regionally, locally, or globally. So this leads to extinction, right? Obviously mass extinction in that area. If it's a global event, it could be mass extinction globally. There are 7, 8, sometimes people say 9 mass extinction events across Earth's time. And the catastrophic people, these people that believe in catastrophism, they usually will put their timelines. The end and the beginning of one time is a catastrophic event. So you end one time frame in Earth's history with a catastrophic event and begin a new one right after it. So this leads to extinction. Extinction has a couple of effects, if you will, on the planet itself. It removes a bunch of animals out of the picture. It might be the reason we're missing fossils, right? It also could add to the fossil count, right? If it wasn't something that destroyed the animal carcasses or the fossils, prevented them from developing. And on the planet itself, it opens up a bunch of what we're going to call niches and allows evolution to happen, right? Because you've removed all these organisms that were in a particular area, and now that area can be recolonized, right, by new species. Great example, one of the better examples, right? The large asteroid that hit the Yucatan about 65 million years ago, right? There's a tremendous crater underwater, mostly underwater, right off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, that the rock dates to about 65 million years ago, right when the dinosaurs disappeared. All of them, all of the major ones, which were dominating the planet. Mammals were around at that time. They just were pretty small and not very assuming, and all pretty much shaped the same way. Remove the dinosaurs, the mammals fill the niches, right? And so you get the explosion of mammal diversity, and now mammals are the major terrestrial environmental organisms, right? Replacing the dinosaurs. So that catastrophic event allowed for the rapid evolution of mammals. Does that make sense? Now, there were other geologists that were like, no, this is not the major shaping tool, if you will, of planet Earth during its life history. An older concept is something called uniformitarianism, which is small, uniform, consistent, slow changes over time, which was published by Charles Lyell, this coined term, in the 1830s, which really goes back to the late 1700s when Hutton suggested that the Earth changes slowly. It takes lots of time for it to change slowly, and he even proposed back then the Earth cannot just be 10,000 years old. When you see these tremendous features, these worn away mountains, it takes a lot longer for that mountain to arise and erode to its present form than 10,000 years. Right, these guys suggested the Earth was several 100 million years old, which is much older than the 20,000 years at the most that they thought the Earth was at the time, based on creationism and church teachings. And of course, we now know the Earth is really old, right? It's somewhere in the range of 4 to 4.5 billion years old, based on radio dating of not only Earth rocks, the oldest Earth rocks, but rocks from the moon and rocks from asteroids, right? Give us this date when the Earth arose out of the Big Bang, right? Or when the creation of our present planets that we see today. You know, is this? Do we know this for sure? It's exactly that number of years? Of course not, but it's somewhere close to that. The Earth is really old, right? It's very old. Yes. They did not. They thought it was several hundred million years. We now know, based on mathematics and radio dating, that it's more in the billions of years, right? So it's very old. These things, like, has everybody been to the Grand Canyon? Nobody been? Who's been to it? It's incredible, isn't it? If you got to go someday and check it out. A river did that, right? It didn't do it in 100 years or 10,000 years. It did it in hundreds of millions of years, right? It took a long time for it to erode away the canyon that we call the Grand Canyon. What's really cool about the Grand Canyon, geologists and fossil hunters love the place, because all these strata of rock that you see are different time frames of Earth's history, and they all have different fossils in them. So it's exposed Earth, right? And it's exposed very old Earth that dates back to hundreds of millions of years, and you can start seeing really cool fossils in there. And so it's a great place for fossil hunting, and there's been a lot of fossil digs done there. Okay, continental drift is also very important, because obviously with the biogeography idea, our continents aren't close to each other anymore, right? They're kind of spread out at this point of Earth's history. But that doesn't mean they've always been that way. And this was proposed in the 1850s, that the continents, we knew the shape of them and they kind of fit into a puzzle at this point, sat on big slabs and are moving around, right? Constantly moving. They're moving on a molten core. The Earth is alive, if you will, in quotation marks. It is not cool. It's actually very warm in the center and has molten metals and rock and all of that underneath. And these continents are moving, and they're in plates, right? So continental drift simply states that the continents are moving. The mechanism is plate tectonics. You guys heard of the term plate tectonics? There are plates, right? You can look them up, the continental plates. These plates are floating around next to each other, and in some places, one plate is growing, that is, you're adding new molten rock from underneath is coming up and cooling and forming new ocean floor and pushing the continents away from each other. On the other side, this continent is now slamming into the other one, right? At different faults. And so one plate will be here and the other one will hit it and either go over top of it or go under it, depends on where you're at. So you get mountains that rise up, right? Or you get plates that are being crushed underneath, which pushes mountains up also. Those are called fault lines, aren't they? So there's a major one in California. There's a major one running through Costa Rica. There are several of them all over the place where these plates meet. And at those areas, you find things like volcanoes, right? Because the crust is open in those areas, or at least the molten core is close enough where you can get molten lava coming up, or rock from underneath that will then be distributed into the atmosphere, right? So things like earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic activity happen at these places. So if you look up Ring of Fire on Google, it'll give you this kind of ring of volcanoes in different places in the world. Follow fault lines, right, where the volcanoes arise. So obviously this explains why we have biogeography and why our continents are spread apart. But the one thing I also want you to realize is that if you imagine a bunch of life evolving in a big mass of land that sat at the equator, that's where Pangea was, sitting on the equator, really close to the equator. If you know anything about the equator, if you've been close to the equator, it's warm, it's a consistent amount of light, dark, temperatures are pretty consistent. Rainfall can be seasonal, but it can be really consistent in some places. Environmentally, this would be really good for life, right? really good for life. Now imagine the continent starts spreading north and south. As you move towards the poles, the weather changes dramatically, right? Climate changes dramatically. Drought, lots of rain, snow, ice. That's going to have a major effect on who can survive and who can't. So it's going to drive evolution, isn't it? It's going to drive evolution. So drift does help drive this concept of what we're going to call natural selection, where the environment is bombarding organisms and only those with the best adaptations for that environment are going to survive. Okay? That's happened globally, right? It happened at a large level. All right, so all of you are biologists. I assume all of you have a pretty good, at least, belief that evolution's real, right? If you don't, I'm going to convince you. Well, at least give you evidence for it. So I'm going to use basically 8 major phenomena, 8 major tenets, if you will. I could give you more, but eight's enough. That's what the textbook does. I just follow mostly the textbook. You'll learn more if you take the class evolution. Dr. Milne teaches it, I think. He's really good. But all you have to do is start, looking around. Look around at the Earth itself. So I've used a couple things here. So here's a little rhesus monkey. This is wheat, all right? And wheat germ are the seeds on top, or you can crush that into wheat germ. This is a protein here called cytochrome C. So the importance of cytochrome C, it's a mitochondrial protein. And these are all eukaryotes, right? All these animals and plants are eukaryotes or fungi. Yeast is a fungus there at the bottom. They all have mitochondria. They all have this protein cytochrome C. So if animals were fixed and don't change, then the cytochrome C protein should be the same in all of those, right? Right? That should be the same protein. If we apply that concept of creationism or that concept of species are fixed, then these should all look alike. They don't. And what's even more interesting is that if we use the chimpanzee, we take that cytochrome C and compare it to all of these organisms, notice that the chimp only has one difference in its cytochrome C protein compared to chimps, which means it makes sense because that's a monkey, right? And a chimp is an ape or a hominid, as is the rhesus monkey. And rabbits are mammals, just like these guys, but notice there are more changes because rabbits aren't monkeys. And if you go all the way down to the yeast, which is a fungus, it's not even an animal, it has the most changes, right? So these different organisms have different mutation rates, they have differences in their proteins. The proteins are different even at the molecular level, and obviously macroscopically these all look different, don't they? Right? They have their own phenotypes. So if you're looking at phenotypes change in different organisms over generations of evolution. So we're going to see this at every level of organization, from the protein structure all the way up to, this guy looks the way he does because he fits a particular environment, right? Okay, so let's look at these 8 tenets or 8, phenomena that really suggest evolution happens and has been happening for billions of years. The first thing are fossils. Right, so fossils are a nice indicator of evolution. They're not, they're not 100% tell the story of evolution, but they do give a good idea that there have been lots of organisms on the planet, and a lot of them have died. Right, a lot of them have gone extinct. The big problem with fossils are only things that are really hard and strong, and they resist degradation, are the ones that actually fossilize well. So things like bone, wood, shells, tracks, things like burrows, pollen grains, eggs, feces, organisms that have hard components are what fossilize well. Soft organisms do not fossilize well. We don't have great fossils of jellyfish. We have some, but not lots of them. We don't have great fossils. They're soft without any hard components to it. But vertebrates, we have great fossils of vertebrates, right? So here you got a bony fish here. Looks a lot like a fish you see today, right? This here is a trilobite, something that doesn't even exist anymore on the planet. It looks really alien, right? They went extinct hundreds of millions of years ago. That fossilized really well. But there are organisms we don't have a great fossil record for. And so that's one of the major arguments of creationists, is there's no transitional fossils for a bunch of organisms. And our answer to that is that we either haven't found it, right? Or it just didn't fossilize well. And to become a fossil, certain things have to happen. Like you have to die, right? Or be buried. You have to be buried quickly, near or in water. And sediment has to settle over the top of you and compress quickly, removing oxygen and degradation. And then that will lead to fossilization overall, as long as you don't get too much shifting, right? Which happens a lot. So even getting the fossils we have is pretty incredible, because the fossilization process takes a long time, and you need very special conditions for that. And in these areas where you find lots of fossils, are typically old deltas or lakes or places where organisms fell to the bottom or lived in those lakes, fell to the bottom, or oceans, and then were buried with sediment. And so it makes sense that sediment's added every year, every 100 years, every 10 years, however you want to think about it. And so the oldest fossils will be the deepest, right? And the newest or most recent living organisms will be on top. That's typically happens, but they argue that there are places this doesn't happen, and that's true. Think about the plates. If I have a bunch of fossils at this continent edge and this continent edge, and this one gets forced underneath, you might end up with new fossils really deep, right? I mean, come on, of course. There's always an explanation of why. So I've seen that argument before also. It just depends on what has happened in those areas. You know, the earth does shift. Rock layers can be broken up and mixed together, which makes it really difficult. But in areas where there's little disturbance, there's typically really good fossil records if fossilization happened. So fossils are really nice. So fossils generally progress in complexity. That is, the older fossils are the least complex. The newest or youngest fossils are the most complex. And typically older fossils are the deeper fossils, and younger fossils are closer to the Earth's crust or to the surface of the Earth today. And there are some magnificent fossils out there. So I had one student ask, how do we know that feathers and hair and stuff like that were on early mammals or birds? You can see feathers. These are outlines of feathers here. On this particular velociraptor, this is called Archaeopteryx. It's a famous velociraptor. So intact fossilization of what's called an archosaur, which is a dinosaur that gave rise to velociraptors and T-Rex. This is an older version of it. But you can see the feathers. Feathers developed really early. This animal could not fly. All right? So feathers developed for some other reason than flight, initially, at least. That's called pre-adaptation, by the way, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Or if you take vertebrate anatomy, I talk more about evolution of vertebrates, at least, if you ever take that class. So we do have really good fossil series for a number of animals, and then we have really bad fossil series for other groups of animals. This is the way it is. When I say we have a good fossil series, what does that mean? We have really good transitional forms. And what you can see, and what Darwin can see, and what geologists can see, is very gradual change over time, most of the time. So you can actually see the small incremental changes in a directional way from least complex to most complex in fossils of groups of organisms that have a good fossil record. Whales, fantastic fossil record. Humans, we have a pretty good fossil record for the hominids. Horses, giraffes, and elephants have great fossil records. And mollusks, because the shell fossilizes really well. All right, shells fossilize really well. So fossils, therefore, are great evidence that animals are not fixed, that they actually change over time. So what do I mean by that? This trilobite down here, we know it's a trilobite. We know this is a trilobite. I mean, they all look similar enough that we can say, oh, trilobites. But they're all different. They're not all the same. They've changed from generation to generation, or over large amounts of time, if you will. Here's whales. This is the whales fossil. Yep.
The last slide. What is a transitional? Oh wait, transitional.
Transitional. Yeah, you're good. Okay, here's whales. So here's the modern whale. This is sperm whale up here. It's a toothed whale, right? Here's the skeleton. It's quite large. Here is the ancestor, or the oldest ancestor that we have, complete fossil that we have of the whale line. Goes back about 50 million years. If you look at any mammal, the oldest mammals are 50 million years old, right? Why? Because at about 65 million years ago is when that large asteroid hit the Yucatan, and the dinosaurs disappear right after that. All right? So within about 10 million years of that, you start to get a large diversity of mammals filling those niches that dinosaurs used to dominate. And so you start to get, all of the mammal lines are forming. So when you go and look at horses, look, 55 million years ago, right? This is our oldest horse fossil. When you look at elephants, oldest elephant fossil, 55 million years ago, right? All the major mammal groups, you can find their oldest fossils, if they exist, about 55 million years ago. So let's back up here, back to the whale. This is a picture, an artist's rendition of what this animal looked like, right? This guy here, all right? Did it look like that? I mean, I don't know if it had that color hair or what it looked like, right? Now, the nice thing about new technology that works really well is we have programs that can build skeletal muscle, dermis, epidermis, connective tissue, and build a three-dimensional feature of probably what this animal looked like. But fur color, eye color, ear color, we don't know those things. But we have a really good idea. This is kind of what it probably looked like. It's very dog-like, isn't it? Looks a lot like a dog. But the major feature that you use for the whale line is the skull. So if you look at the skull of this guy, it's very small, but it's very whale-like as far as what the skull looks like. This skull evolves particularly to support a really large organ here for sonar. And the other major thing that you see here is that they start to lose their limbs over time, right? This is a transitional, completely aquatic animal. This animal here is completely terrestrial, right? So they move into water. There's a bunch of other transitional fossils here. As they move into water, they do lose their legs as evolution continues because they become useless. The other cool thing that you see here is there's still remnants of the back legs even in the modern whales. Part of the hip is still there. It's called a vestigial structure. It's pretty useless now for whales, but it shows you that the animals are related and have changed over time, right? Same with horses. Again, the horse skull is really important. Notice all the skulls are very similar. This guy's about 10 pounds, 15 pounds probably. It's about the size of a really small dog, about the size of my bulldog maybe. Bulldog's 45 pounds, but again, very small, about 55 million years ago, and then starts developing through evolution. This animal was probably a boundary animal, lived part of its life in the forest, part of its life in grassland. But obviously the evolution of this is pushing the organism into a large grassland, prairie type of organism that has a huge digestive tract to allow for the digestion of cellulose. And a lot of what you see inside of the mouth, particularly the teeth and jaws, are for grinding and helping to start the digestive process of grasses, which are really hard to digest because of cellulose. So here are a couple of drawings of this what we call ancestral fossil or common ancestor of horses. Here's elephants, another great line of fossils for the elephants. Again, the earliest elephant-like fossils are about 50 million years ago, something like that. And there are a wide variety of different types of species here that have arisen over time. Your living elephants up here. Woolly mammoths are probably one of the closer recent common ancestors of the modern elephants. You guys know that up north where the permafrost is. You guys have heard of permafrost before? The term permafrost. We'll talk about different environmental biomes on planet Earth, but the permafrost is this frozen tundra that's up north where there aren't trees above the Arctic Circle, is now starting to melt because of global warming, right? Which doesn't exist also if you talk to certain people. But permafrost is shrinking, every 15, 20 years. And ice, as it freezes, expands. And so when it starts to melt, it shrinks. And what's coming out of the permafrost ice are like full carcasses of things, like woolly mammoths, ground sloths, saber-toothed tigers. It's pretty cool, man, with fur and everything. So that's pretty interesting. So we're even getting animals out of the permafrost now that are more recent species, particularly in the mammal line. It's pretty cool. So fossils, a great example of species change over time, right? 2 are homologous structures. So what's a homologous structure? A homologous structure, and this is really important because the first people who jump on Darwin's bandwagon, once they read his Origin of Species, are anatomists, people that study anatomy, particularly those people who study skeletons, because it just it's like a light bulb turned on for those guys, right? And the reason for that, all you have to do is look at a group of animals that are related, like mammals. And a whale, a cat, a human, think of any other mammal you think is really weird, right? That doesn't look like a human. We're all mammals. And you might say, well, how are we all mammals? Well, you see hair and all of that, right? But go and look at the skeleton. If you look at the skeleton, put the arms next to each other, they all have the same bones. Now, those bones have been modified, haven't they? They've changed over time. And each of these mammals fit a niche, don't they? Their bones are shaped to fit that niche. So they were shaped over time to fit a niche, but all of the same bones are there. So this shows you evidence of common ancestry. Every mammal has a humerus, an ulna, a radius, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. They've all been modified to fit the environment they live in. If you look at a horse, the same thing. Huge bones, right? But you can see them. Then the phalanges and the metacarpals have been shaped into a hoof. There's one big phalanx, only a couple major carpals and metacarpals. They've been, worked by the environment over time to fit a niche so that they can survive the extremes, constraints, the environmental pressures of that particular niche they live in. So homologous structures are structures that are at least organized or at least appear similar to each other, and you can trace them to a common ancestor. Right? These are really important structures to recognize because they allow us to build trees, family trees, if you will, or relatedness trees that allow us to figure out which animals are most closely related to each other. So all of these arose from some common ancestor, right? And in the horse's example, or the elephant's example, it's this guy right here, right? This is the oldest fossil we have. Doesn't necessarily have to be this particular one because there were probably more than one species that were either similar or slightly similar to this one that gave rise to it, but it at least gives us a root, if you will, for our tree, right? To root our tree in time and then allow us to then compare all of these other fossils to that one. Does that make sense? That's what common ancestors do. So we're talking about evidence for evolution. So there's tons of evidence. So it's been tested in many different ways over many different levels of organization. And the first thing we talked about was fossils, right? So we talked a lot about fossils yesterday. And as I mentioned yesterday, I think one of the first groups that really jumped on the Darwin bandwagon after he published The Origin of Species in 1859 were anatomists, were particularly comparative anatomists, which is kind of what I do organismally and microscopically, because they've been looking at skeletons for hundreds of years and fossils for hundreds of years where you get skeletons, and they notice a lot of similarity between groups of limbs, for example, that are shaped differently but have the same components in the same sequence, if you will, as far as bone structure goes. What I mean by that, if you look at, for example, the forelimb, the bone sequence, humerus, ulna, radius, metacarpals, carpals, phalanges, are all the same across multiple groups or taxa of organism. These are mammals, obviously, right? And they all have the same bone structure. So this is due to common ancestry, or at least shows common ancestry or unity. And what shaped the differences in the limbs is the environment, right? And comparative anatomists jumped on that idea because they've seen it over and over again. And a matter of fact, the first phylogenetic trees that start being built on relatedness, how closely related organisms are based on skeletons, because comparative anatomists started using evolution and this mechanism of natural selection to explain the diversity they see in limbs that have similar bone structure. Now, the big problem with this is sometimes structures look alike and even perform the same function, but they don't share, the two organisms don't share close common ancestry. And these are examples of analogous structures. So we'll just think analogous structures equal this type of evolution, which is called convergent evolution. Convergent evolution simply means that the environment is determining what two organisms look like regardless of their common ancestry or how closely related they are. And there are many examples of this where the environment is extreme enough or specific enough, specialized enough, that two organisms that don't share a common ancestor look a lot alike. Wings and fins are great examples. Limbs are great examples. So the wings of a damselfly, this is an insect, look nothing like the wings of a swallow, right? Internally, but they perform the same function, which is flight. So they kind of have a vague similarity, at least externally, and they do the same thing. But the reason they don't look alike internally is because they share completely different ancestors, right? And the environment shaped or helped shape whatever was there into something that's purposeful for flight. And they tend to start to look alike. Same happens with fins. So you have a shark here, extinct reptile called Ichthyosaurus, and then the dolphin. All of those are very distantly related groups that don't share common ancestry. And they all have fins because the aquatic environment shapes limbs into fins so that they can swim. If you look at the internal structure of these, they would look very different from one another as far as what the fin looks like. So those are called convergent traits, or what are called analogous phenotypes. And sometimes it's really hard to tell what's homologous and what's analogous. And that's what makes trees sometimes difficult to make, or common ancestry difficult to make in some instances with certain groups. Particularly if the group is highly specialized. That is, they all live in the water, or they all live underground, and so forth. Here's another great example. So this is a fish. So I've zoomed in on the teeth, and that looks an awful lot like a human mouth, doesn't it? Kind of, when you just look at it briefly. So this fish has teeth that are very similar in shape and size to ours, particularly the molars. This is the largest fish in the piranha family. It's called a pacu. Lives in the Amazon river drainage, and it's a seed crusher. That's what it eats. So it's more of a vegetarian than anything, and these teeth are incredibly powerful. So they crush seeds or fruit that fall in the water. That's what they eat. So obviously not closely related to us, right? We hope not. Okay, number 3 are vestigial structures. You got fossils, homologous and analogous structures, and number 3 are a great source of evidence for evolution are structures that are vestigial. These structures are remnants of common ancestry. Okay, So there are things that are there because they developed along with everything else that developed in an area, but they're not utilized by the organism anymore. In us, the appendix, you guys all heard of appendicitis, right? The appendix is pretty useless to us now. Was very important in our life history because it used to be a major site where we could deal with bacteria and other microorganisms when we ate raw meat. But we cook our meat now, right? Or you should at least cook it a little bit. So the appendix has really been degraded down into a very minute structure that's pretty useless. The same here for a couple of other examples that you see. Molars, and this is a vampire bat skull, showing you the development of the incisors and the canines here, which are utilized to open skin, and they drink blood. That's their major food source. They still have molars, which are used for crushing, chewing, and grinding, but they don't crush and chew and grind anything anymore. And the molars are pretty useless. They're really small, but with the development of the mouth and jaw and teeth, all of those develop during development, as they did in the common ancestor, but they're not utilized here by the vampire bat. Pelvic bones in whales and pelvic bones in snakes, two organisms that don't have back limbs, right? But they come from terrestrial ancestry, or common ancestors that were terrestrial with back limbs. They still have pelvic bones, and in some cases, the pythons still have some of the pieces of the femur, if you will, that you can find. Skin-covered eyes and mole rats. Mole rats come from rodents that lived on the surface. They still have eyes, but they're covered over with skin because they can't use them underground. So there are all kinds of examples of vestigial structures that are evidence of obviously common ancestry, but also that organisms change over time, right, from the common ancestor. Embryology is another great example, and one that I like to talk about because the one thing I always want to make sure people understand is that evolution doesn't create things out of nothingness from thin air. Evolution works on what phenotypes are there, right? Because of that, the phenotypes are going to be modified over time. And you often see in development that gill arches develop in a terrestrial organism, no matter whether they're terrestrial, or no matter that they're not aquatic anymore, that they're completely terrestrial. But those gill arches during development now migrate to become something else, right? That is more useful in the terrestrial environment. Also, what you'll notice is, these are three mammals, and at certain stages of development, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference unless you were an expert on embryology between a lemur, a pig, a human, and another animal, because they all look pretty similar during the developmental process. Also, all vertebrates have tails, or most vertebrates have tails, and gill slits. This is a bad term. I don't really like this term. It's a term that a lot of people use. But being a vertebrate anatomist, we're thinking of, when we say gill slits, we're talking about the pharynx. You guys have heard the term pharynx before? It means throat, right? So in this instance, we're talking about pharyngeal arches, which become gill slits in fish. So the pharyngeal arches are slits in the pharynx during development that first arose to make or to provide gill surface or surfaces for gill lamellae that allow fish to breathe in water. Obviously, those pharyngeal arches are also often called gill slits. But in us, our arches don't become gill slits, they become other structures. They still develop just like fish embryo, but then they migrate. So they form the lower jaw, they form a bone right here that's near the larynx, that's called the hyoid bone, it supports the tongue, and then migrate into the ear to become the three ear ossicles that allow us to hear in air. So fish don't have those types of internal ear structures because they hear through the surface of their skin. So these gill arches, or these pharyngeal arches that become slits in fish, still develop in all terrestrial vertebrates. They just become other structures, right? That are more adaptive or advantageous in the terrestrial environment. That's because all of vertebrates possess the same genes that direct development. Because when your head develops, gill arches develop in the neck, and teeth develop, and jaws develop, and these structures that either become vestigial later on or develop into something else still have to be there in order for everything to line up right. Does that make sense? As far as development goes. So the one big thing you'll learn in development, if you ever take the class, which is a great class here, is that not only are there genes that control when things show up, but there's a sequence to it, right? That show up to give you the right three-dimensional structure in order to interact with your environment. So embryology, another great example of common ancestry. Number 5 is artificial selection. This one was big for Darwin. This one was huge for Darwin's idea of what we're going to call natural selection. All right, what Darwin terms natural selection. Darwin came from a farming community in England, and he knew about cattle, and he knew about sheep, and he knew about other domestic animals that were bred on purpose because of certain features that they have. You breed the best producing milk cows, right, to produce more effective milk cow producers. You take the best meat cows and breed them so that you get the perfect meat. We've been artificially breeding animals for hundreds and hundreds of years. So if we can do that, then why can't nature do that, right? Why can't nature select for phenotypes that fit environments? And so this concept of artificial selection, which we do with dogs and other domestic animals, can be applied to the natural environment. And that's where natural selection comes from. And Darwin's upbringing allowed him to make these connections between nature's way to select for phenotypes and how we select for characteristics that we deem desirable. Whoops. So, biochemistry similarities, all living life, all the way down to the smallest eukaryote, single-celled algae that we saw swimming around in the pond water, all the way up to us and other complicated vertebrates, all share the same biochemical, metabolic chemistry, if you will, or the same biochemistry. We all use DNA, we all use RNA as our instructions for life. We use ribosomes to build proteins, right? Those proteins all are built off of instructions that use the same genetic code and the same alphabet, if you will, which are the 20 amino acids that make up polypeptides and proteins. And all life uses, all eukaryotes at least, use ATP as their energy, universal energy molecule. So that is a great evidence that all animals share common ancestry. We all came from one or more single-celled organisms back in the day that eventually led to all of the diversity that you see. Great examples of this. I put a picture up here of a three-dimensional model of an enzyme called polymerase. All right, so polymerase is the enzyme that builds DNA and RNA. There are a bunch of types of polymerases. But if you take any organism, plant, human, fly, yeast, fungus, whatever it is, and you look at the polymerase protein, it almost is similar across all organisms. Its amino acid sequence is almost exactly the same. And this is one of those really, it's not rare, but one of these unusual examples of a protein that you can't mess with too much. We call them highly conserved proteins, because if you mess with the three-dimensional structure, it can't do its job anymore. And so you can't really play with it too much, right? And so it's very resistant to change because of the functional significance of its shape. And so that's why polymerases across the board, since they make DNA and RNA, are so important in their function. They haven't changed much during the process of life. Histone proteins, remember those proteins that make up nucleosomes where DNA wraps around them? Those look very similar across living eukaryotes because you can't change their shape too much or you affect the way DNA can be condensed. So all of these are really good examples of evidence of common ancestry. Life arose from common ancestors. Now, genomics is no different. So, the Comparative anatomists, those guys that particularly that studied skeletons, are the first kind of group of biologists that jumped on Darwin's bandwagon when he came up with selection and how evolution worked. But genomics is no different. So once that technology arose, much later, right after Darwin was around in the early 1960s, 1970s, we started analyzing genes, right? And we started to see that there are differences in the genes that control protein production. And so this shows, again, evidence that all organisms share common ancestry, because a lot of the genes that control the proteins we have are similar across species, but you can still see differences in the DNA based on how closely related something is. The less change you see in a DNA sequence that controls a gene, the less time those species have been separated from one another. Okay? The last time those species have been separated from one another, or they share a more closely related common ancestor. What's really cool is that based on gene studies, we know we have certain numbers of genes that have a consistent mutation rate, no matter what species you look at. Now, not all DNA is like this. Some DNA mutates really quickly, some DNA mutates very slowly, some DNA doesn't mutate very much at all. But some DNAs, and that's across species, some DNA sequences just mutate at a consistent rate, or a pretty consistent rate. A good example of this is mitochondrial DNA, the DNA that was once its own prokaryote. Particularly the proteins of the electron transport chain, like the cytochrome C protein I pointed out, are often used to do comparisons between species to see how much time has gone by since two species diverged from the common ancestor, or split from a common ancestor. The reason they can do this is because it's pretty consistent. Every 10 to the negative 6 generations, the DNA of a mitochondrial gene mutates. And so you can throw that into a mathematical model and count the number of differences in the cytochrome C protein, for example, between two species. Throw it into the mathematical model and it'll tell you 70 million years ago, these two species diverged from a common ancestor. Or 200 million years ago, or 400 million years ago, or 50 million years ago. It just depends on how closely related they are. These molecular clocks, particularly the ones where we have good fossil records and we have living organisms, vertebrates are a great example of this, like mammals, fit really nicely to the fossil record and the radio dating that they do on rock. And so when you can combine molecular clock data with good fossils and good radio dating, good mathematical models at least, and they corroborate, right? They're similar or they parallel each other, which they do. It gives some pretty strong indication that these clocks are pretty accurate. But you got to pick the right gene. If you pick the wrong gene, it can be really inaccurate. So now, because of that, and if we use that gene, there are organisms that are soft-bodied, right? And if we assume that the mutation rate, even in these soft-bodied organisms which don't have fossils, are not, but we still have them around today, we can actually compare two soft-bodied organisms together, also using the same molecular clock, and at least get some hypothesis on how closely related they are, how long ago that they diverged from one another. Now, outside of all of that evidence that's just sitting around, there are actual observational data that species change over time, from generation to generation. And the species we're going to look at here are ones that have short generation times. They breed very, quickly. So insects, bacteria are the best examples where you can directly observe in a couple seasons, a couple years, over hundreds of generations because they breed so readily. So the first one is resistance to pesticides and, say, antibiotics. So you guys have all heard of antibiotic resistance, right? It's really scary in the medical world. Most bacteria are starting to become pretty resistant to most of the more common antibiotics. So think of MRSA, right? You guys have all heard of MRSA, which is Streptococcus bacteria that's basically now completely resistant to penicillin. So you can't use any of the penicillins or methicillins or anything that ends in cillin as an antibiotic to kill it. You have to use stronger antibiotics. And they're becoming more resistant to those. So eventually we might run out of antibiotics that can kill these superorganisms, right? Some of these very resistant bacteria. Luckily, or at least doctors are more cognizant of this now, and they tend to be a little more cautious on when they, hopefully your doctor does, when he gives you or antibiotics, right? If it's viral, we don't want to give you antibiotics, correct? Because then the bacteria in your body can become resistant to them. And remember, when a bacteria becomes resistant, it can pass that resistance on to other bacteria via plasmids, right? We kind of talked about that. And so with resistance evolving in bacteria, it's easier for them to pass it on to other strains of bacteria that might be infectious. So that's what we worry most about. Luckily, science keeps producing new antibiotics or new molecules that act like or provide some resistance similar to antibiotics. Insects are also a very good example of this. So there used to be the classical combat insecticide that you could buy that would kill roaches in houses. Most roach species, at least the more common German cockroaches, very resistant to combat it, that this pesticide doesn't work anymore. You have to use a different one in order to kill the roaches. Bed bugs are the same way. Bed bugs are becoming incredibly resistant to a number of very common antibiotics. And so it gets harder and harder to get rid of them. So most pesticides work via molecules that mimic neurotransmitters. Have you guys ever heard of neurotransmitters? So a neurotransmitter is a protein, often a protein, that is released by nerves to control other cells, like muscle contraction, for example. Or it works between nerves in the central nervous system. So often these pesticides mimic nerve control of the body, and that's why it kills them. DEET's another really good example. It works really well, but it also affects our nervous system. Don't ever get DEET on your lips or in your mouth. It'll make everything go numb. Plus, it's toxic. I mean, you want to keep it off your face. But it numbs the nerves because the nerves stop working right. It mimics acetylcholine, which is the major neurotransmitter in your body. Now, outside of us spraying or using antibiotics on organisms that breed really quickly, there are some other wonderful examples of evolution that we can see real time in species that breed real quickly and have several generations in a summer, for example, or over several years. And this is a really great example the textbook uses. It's called the soapberry bug. It's a bug that's found, there are several species that are found throughout the southern United States. There's also a similar looking convergent or analogous type of bug that's found in Australia where the same pattern is happening. Now, as you guys know, we humans like to put plants in our mulch beds, right? And a lot of those plants are non-native plants that you go to Lowe's, you buy some plants, you buy them because they're pretty, they got a pretty flower, they smell good. They're not necessarily from the US, right? They might be from Indonesia, they might be from somewhere else. This is happening all over the world. And these bugs start feeding on them, all right? And the soapberry beetle has a very specialized mouth part. So they've taken the mandible and all of the parts of the mouth that make up the mouth and have formed a long needle-like structure that's called a beak, or sometimes it's called a proboscis. They take this and insert it into fruit and push it into the fruit down to where the seeds are, and that's where all the sugary, juicy material is, and then they suck all that up. Right, and that's what they feed on are the fruits by pushing the beak through the outer exterior of the fruit and then sucking juices from the inside. What's interesting is when scientists started studying the bug, there are people that like to do this, were measuring beak length in soapberry bugs, and they found a correlation between the length of the beak and the depth of the seed, how far the seed is in the fruit. And effective lengths, you can imagine, the length would go down to the seed, right? It would penetrate deep enough to reach the seed. So native soapberry bugs feed on a vine that produces a very thick exterior to its fruit, so they have really long beaks in order to reach the seeds. Now in southern Florida, they were studying the soapberry bugs and found that they feed on the native plant called balloon vine, which has really large, thick fruit with large, thick exteriors, and they have really long beaks in order to reach the seeds. In the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, something like that, Florida started bringing in, or at least landscapers started bringing in a really pretty tree called a golden rain tree, which they were planting in mulch beds in strip malls and at houses as they built homes. This particular plant is not an invasive species, but it's just found everywhere, right? Where they plant it. And the soapberry bugs started feeding on it. And interestingly, in Central Florida, there's a population of these bugs that now have a much shorter beak than the original native population. And that's because they feed exclusively on the fruit of the golden rain, which is a smaller fruit with a very thin external shell. And so they can reach the seeds faster and feed more effectively on it. And therefore, their phenotype is changing in like 30 years. Right? So you're having populations of these soapberry bugs that are feeding exclusively on the golden rain and populations feeding exclusively on the balloon vine, which is pretty interesting, right? What this is leading, these differences in phenotype could lead to speciation event, where you're taking microevolution, these small changes in phenotype from generation to generation, and you produce 2 new species of soapberry bug. Now that hasn't happened yet. It will take a long time for that to happen. But one thing we'll talk about in the next lecture, give you a little foreshadowing. How do we do that? How do we become 2 species from 1? If this population of new soapberry bug with its shorter beak finds or meets its mate on these trees when they're feeding, and the native bug does the same thing, mates where it's feeding on the balloon vine tree, then you're going to have 2 populations that are now reproductively isolated, right? And if they exclusively are breeding on the golden rain versus the balloon vine, eventually they might not interbreed anymore. And when that happens, you get 2 new species. And that's typically how macroevolution happens, or what we call speciation. So we could be witnessing, for example, the beginning of a major speciation event in soapberry bugs because a group of them are feeding on a different fruit based on the phenotype that they have. So remember, genetic variation leads to phenotypic variation, right? And that's what evolution or natural selection works on. So they've seen correlations between fruit size and beak size in a number of different areas, including Louisiana, Oklahoma, and even Australia, where you have different groups of soapberry bugs or similar bugs that feed on fruits using this long needle-like beak. Pretty neat, right? Birds are another great example of this that you can watch real time. Right? The birds were a big component of Darwin's observation, and these are Galapagos finches. So and I'll show you a little bit here in a few minutes of where Darwin went and how he traveled during his travels, and then that'll help you kind of understand the biogeographical kind of concept that he was using to help him understand different groups of organisms living in different parts of the world. But the question is, what is evolution really? And really, all evolution is, microevolution in particular, these things that happen from generation to generation, is the increase of one particular trait over another one, right? And remember, a trait is a phenotype. So you have a phenotype in a population increasing while others are decreasing. So in the soapberry bug, it was the beak length. So you went from long beaks to short beaks in one of the populations because they're feeding on a different food source. Think about that. Those bugs that had short beaks started feeding on that food source because the long beak ones couldn't or weren't. So they're exploiting a resource that the major population wasn't using. That allowed that population to grow particularly all of the bugs that were born with short beaks, right? Were able to grow and reproduce. And that's kind of how it works. Those traits start to increase within a population when they become advantageous. As they increase, others decrease, right? So you're changing phenotypes from generation to generation. The same thing happens in birds a lot, which feed with beaks, right? So here are 3 birds, 3 finches. They all look like finches. They're all about the same size. They're not, real big birds, but the major difference is their beaks. These are 3 examples. One here has a very sharp kind of medium-sized beak that it uses to feed on cactus flowers and the interior of cactus leaves. The second one here is an insect feeder. It has a much shorter, sharper beak. This is a smaller finch that can fly really fast. It's an insectivore. It eats insects. Looks a lot like a warbler as far as its phenotype. And then the larger of the finches, a more robust bird that has a huge, powerful, almost parrot-like beak that it can crush large fruits and seeds with. Each one of these birds, which landed on the Galapagos Islands, their ancestors were chosen for a phenotypic variation in beak size, right? Which was then enhanced over time because it allowed them to feed in a certain niche. So feeding niches are really important as far as looking at how evolution works. So that's what evolution is. It's change from generation to generation of phenotypic traits that are controlled by genotype. Make sense? So far, so good? So, those are things you can see, but the question is then, well, how? I mean, how does this work? And we need a mechanism, right? And the problem is that most mechanisms that had been hypothesized up to the point of Darwin were wrong, right? They were incorrect or inconsistent. But one of the first kind of scientists to say, hey, you know what? Species aren't fixed. They change over time. And it was Lamarck. So this was one of the first guys it's called Lamarckism or gradualism, that organisms can change over time. And his mechanism was that they acquire characteristics over their lifetime that they then pass to their offspring. Okay? And so what he would say is that a giraffe would continue to stretch its neck during its life, and then however long its neck was, it would then pass that length on to the next generation. And then they would stretch a little more and pass that on to the next generation, right? So you can see what's wrong with that, right? That the traits we acquire during our lifetime are not going to be passed to our offspring because they're not in the gamete. Your phenotype was inherited, right? And then you pass it on. If that were the case, all Arnold Schwarzenegger's kids would be bodybuilders when they were born, right? But they're not. Now, they might have the genetics to become a bodybuilder, but they would have to go out and do that, right? That type of work in order to acquire that particular phenotype. So you're born with the phenotypes that evolution can work on. That was where Lamarck was wrong. But he's criticized for that now, made fun of now, right, in a lot of circles. But he was one of the first people to at least start questioning, hey, animals don't all look alike. You can look at fossils, look at life history, look at the diversity out there. They're not fixed. They do change over time or have changed over time. And he at least tried to give a mechanism that showed this. Darwin's mechanism is a lot different than stretching the neck and passing it on. His argument here would be that when you look at the giraffe lineage, right? If you were to look at, we have a good fossil record for giraffes, that evolution exploited neck length, and it did it slowly because there's variation in neck length in the population, right? And those that had neck lengths that were enhanced were the ones selected for, and that took a long time to reach that point, right? In order to get animals that had necks that were as long as they are today. You have to be able, that trait or that phenotype has to be inheritable. It has to be passed with the gametes. Another mechanism that was introduced that species change over time is something that's called saltationism, which at first was laughed at, all right, and the people didn't think it occurred. That it was criticized and and said not to be true immediately after it was released. And it was Saint Hilaire that released this in 1822. And basically what he said is that large, sudden, non-gradual changes in form from one generation to the next can occur, which means that from one generation to another, species change and become new species. So you got speciation in one generation. Darwin agreed that it would at least take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of generations in order to see a major change in microevolution actually taking effect or taking hold, and then even hundreds of more before a speciation event would come, hundreds or thousands of more generations. This is pretty rare. We now know that it actually occurs, but it's a very rare situation that allows for a species in one generation to give rise to two new species in the next, in an immediate breeding event. This happens, for example, in endosymbiotic theory. When you take up a new organism, keep that organism around, and now you can do something that your parents could not, right? Like the nitroplast group that I told you about, that new species of marine algae that can fix its own nitrogen. Plants actually do this more often than any other taxa of organism. They practice polyploidy. What's really interesting is you can get two closely related plant species that differ in chromosomes, and they can actually breed on accident. Their pollen meets an egg, and you'll have a plant that has 30 chromosomes and a plant that has 40 chromosomes or 35, and they meet, their pollen meets one of the eggs of the other, and they produce an offspring that has the wrong number of chromosomes. It has 37 now. It can't breed back to the parent, either parent, right? But remember, I told you plants are tolerant of chromosome number. So their chromosome number is a little different. But what can a plant do that no other organism can do? Well, not any other organism, but what can it practice? Self-fertilization, right? It can actually breed with itself. So now all of a sudden you get this group of new offspring that are a different species. And it's called polyploidy, right? So polyploidy, if you're an organism that can tolerate wrong numbers of chromosomes, which are plants and very few animals, then you could do this. You could produce a completely new species in one generation that can't breed back to the adult. That's for speciation to happen, you can't breed back to the original population, right? You got to be your own group that interbreeds. Does that make sense? It's called reproductive isolation. And messing with chromosome number will do that. Right? Will do that so you can't breed back to the parent. Make sense? All right, so let's talk about Darwin's mechanism, because it obviously gave us a mechanism that we have tested over and over and over and over and over again, and it stood the test of time. So what did he do? So this is his route, all right, the route that he traveled, okay? So you can see that they came down, they left England, traveled along kind of Spain there and Africa, and crossed the ocean over to South America, and then went around the world, all right, and then to the Galapagos eventually, where he spent a lot of time because they had a lot of boat problems around the Galapagos, and also near Madagascar, which is right here, where he got to spend a lot of time on land collecting lots of organisms. He also spent a lot of time along the South American coast, as you can see. So they made many stops before they headed back. And this took 5 years, okay? So he was he lived 5 years away from home, and his whole job was, as the naturalist on the Beagle, was to collect as many specimens as he could and also take meticulous notes on all the life that he saw and observed. He also saw volcanic eruptions, major earthquakes, large catastrophic events in South America in particular, that really honed in on some of the ideas of how evolution works. The islands that he visited, and there were lots of them, notice, as that he passed, were also very, very rich in species diversity, because islands or where evolution happens rapidly. It's one of the places where evolution can happen really rapidly, because the Galapagos being a great example of this, it's close enough to the coast so that sometimes species can make it to it, but far enough away that once you're there, you really don't want to go back, right? It's too far, right? So if you get blown off course and you're a bird that's flying, you're flying in the wrong direction, when you reach land, you're gonna stay there, right? I mean, you're gonna stay there if you can. You don't want to just fly out into open ocean. It's pretty far away as far as how far away it is from the coast of South America. And so what he noticed is that when he got to the Galapagos, that a lot of the species of bird that were there were finches. They were obviously finches. They look a lot like the finches, or at least some of them do, that you find on the mainland, on the western side of the mainland of South America. But the big difference was their beaks, and there were lots of them, lots of different finches that had very different beaks. So lots of diversity and separate species because they didn't interbreed, and they all fed on different sources of food based on their beak size and shape. He also saw this in the tortoises. The tortoises are absolutely humongous. There aren't other humongous tortoises anywhere else in the world, but there are smaller species of tortoise on the coast, right, and on the western jungle or western edges of grasslands of South America. But he also saw lots of variation between the tortoises from island to island, and that goes the same for the birds. They are adapted and fit the shape or phenotype that allows them to do well in whatever environment or niche that they're feeding on. So he noticed this here, he noticed it in Madagascar, he noticed it in other areas, that species phenotypes fit their environments really well. So he used iguanas. The marine iguana is one of the only lizards that feed in ocean water. The finches were huge. So he used iguanas, finches, and the tortoises a lot in the origin of species. Here's the beagle, right? It spent a lot of time on shore. That's why it took so long to get around the world, because boats back then were susceptible to storms and whatnot. A lot of sail and hull repairs were done. So he spent a lot of time in certain places, particularly South America and the Galapagos. Now, once he got back, and after that 5-year journey, he slowly started putting together his notes and his thoughts on what he saw out there, that species are not fixed. He obviously figured that out based on the organisms he saw across the world, and comparing them to, say, fossils that are very similar. He also saw fossils were very different on different parts of the world, and also very similar depending on where they were found. And he used those ideas of what we call biogeography in order to think about species distribution. Darwin did coin the term natural selection. All right. Remember, artificial selection was big because he came from a farming community. And in this instance, he was thinking that nature is selecting for traits that are advantageous to the animal. Those animals that are selected for will survive and reach reproductive age and then pass those traits on to their offspring, right? So it's called descent by modification. So you're descending from a common ancestor, and there's a variable amount of phenotypes in that ancestral population, and in certain environments, you are going to modify which of those phenotypes make it to reproductive age, therefore directionally selecting specific phenotypes to fit environments. That's basically the mechanism that he suggests, and he's going to suggest the tenets of that mechanism and how it works in the next couple slides. Really interesting, another scientist, and I've already mentioned this, Alfred Russel Wallace, came up with almost the same terminology, called it selection, or something similar to natural selection, and wrote to Darwin in 1858. So notice that's 1 year prior to when Darwin actually published. That's a long time after Darwin got back. He was sitting on this, on this kind of mechanism, on this data for a long period of time before he actually published it, because Wallace forces him to actually publish it, right? Somebody else figured out something I already know, I better publish it. These two are credited for the process of natural selection. They actually co-authored a short communication, what they called an essay back then, in late 1858, that was presented to the scientific community of England. And again, a lot of people jumped on it, particularly the anatomists. But then in 1859, Darwin published The Origin of Species, which is a huge manuscript on all of the observational data that he had collected, providing massive amounts of evidence and the mechanism of what natural selection is. And that's why he's immortalized by that publication. The publication thing is big. They call it in the sciences publish or perish. But if you want to be immortalized or be known for something, you have to get it down in print. So here's a picture of what the front page of The Origin of Species, and these are one of the notebooks of Darwin and all of the notes that he kept. One of my favorite note pages is this one. It's a favorite of many people that are biologists, particularly people who like phylogenetics. This is the first phylogenetic tree. Darwin, and it was kind of the godfather of phylogenetic trees too. This is the first tree that shows common ancestry. He was just writing, I love this, I think, right? And then he's got common ancestor 1, common ancestor 2, and then how all animals can be traced back based on a number of characteristics or traits that we'll call ancestral traits. And then we separate them into dichotomous groups based on features that allow them to specialize in their environment, right? Like homologous structures, which we're going to use to figure out relatedness between organisms. So this descent by modification is a big thing, right? Let's go back to, let's see, we were here, right? So he published this in 1859. Darwin explained 3 broad major observations and connected them. They are the unity of life. That is, there is common ancestry across all life. And there's lots of things that we share and make us animals, or make us plants, or make certain organisms fungi. But there is tremendous diversity of life within groups of organisms. And the reason there is so much diversity is because of selection or environmental specialization, right? Niche specialization. This diversity is driven by that most organisms match their environment in some way so that they can exploit the environment or have an adaptation in the environment. And here's another wonderful example, right? So you guys see the moth, right? You see the moth there? This moth is cryptically camouflaged. It even has the shape, texture, and color pattern of leaves on the leaf floor of a rainforest. And so predators can't find this moth. If it was bright white, it would stick out, right? And so you can imagine moths over time were selected for based on their pattern and their color. And pattern and color mutate a lot and are easily controlled in insects and in other organisms. And so, this is, if I survive, I breed, right? So it's based on color. So again, Darwin never used the word evolution. Evolution is, a word that has been around a long time. No one person has been able to kind of coin the word evolution. But he did coin the phrase descent by modification and natural selection. These are the phrases that he used. And traits instead of phenotypes were the phrase that he used that were selected for, that we now call phenotypes. And the way that descent by modification works is based on this mechanism. So Darwin made 4 major observations that he saw across all of his studies that for the mechanism of how natural selection works. The first thing he states is that no matter what organism you look at, populations often vary greatly in what traits that you see. Right? Whatever the trait is you pick, what phenotypes. So What I want you to immediately notice is he used the word population, right? Individuals do not evolve. Individuals do not evolve. Populations evolve, okay? It's the human population that evolves, not Kevin, Dr. Gribbins, that evolves, right? It's the population and what phenotypes we have that are actually what are selected for. Members of any population typically show tremendous variation. Here are ladybugs, group of ladybugs. In the fall, you usually see a bunch of ladybugs come together, right? As they overwinter. And man, I've seen ladybugs that are completely black. I've seen ladybugs with no spots. We've seen ladybugs at my house that are almost striped. So there are lots of variation in color and pattern of ladybugs. Snails, any organism that you put together in a room and look at them, you're going to find some variation in what they look like, right? That's important. That's controlled by genetic variation. This is the importance of sex, right? Mixing of alleles gives you lots of phenotypes, lots of traits. Number 2, traits are inherited from parent to offspring. That is, what you see, their offspring will have, whatever combination of alleles and traits that are observed in the parents. So these have to be heritable traits that we are interested in passing on to our future generations. Number 3, all species produce more offspring than survive. We're talking about the population now, right? No matter how slowly a population reproduces, it reproduces. Eventually, it'll reach a size that is too big for all of them to survive. We're pushing it ourselves, right? As far as the human population goes. Even elephants, even though they only reproduce every 2 to 3 years, can produce a population over time that will be larger than its resources. Number 4, due to the lack of food or other resource, many of those offspring will die eventually, right? So not every offspring born into a population of organisms will survive. Therefore, because of those 4 tenets, individuals who inherit beneficial traits or phenotypes, we can call them adaptations or phenotypes, will survive and reproduce in the next generation. The other ones die off. So unequal survivability and reproduction in a population leads to an accumulation of favorable traits. Directional selection of phenotypes. The nature or the environment, or what we're going to call selection pressures, are selecting for favorable traits. Another great example, do you guys see the praying mantis? So it looks just like the flowers. Can sit on the flower and wait for the bug to come in, and man, it's easy to find food that way, isn't it? So they look just like the flower there. Again, another example of camouflage. Camouflage is a huge one that evolution works on. But there are, any trait that you look at has probably been selected for over millennia for animals that fit their niche very well. So this is beautifully done. It almost makes, isn't it like common sense? I mean, it's common sense. This, and this, therefore this, based on just observational data and all of the science that he's read. Geology, population dynamics, all the things that he was reading at the time, and then his ability to attach artificial selection to natural selection gave him a mechanism for the descent by modification. And it's been tested hundreds of thousands of times in hundreds of thousands of ways, and has stood the test of time, and that's why natural selection it's the theory of evolution. All right, we call it Darwinian evolution or gradualism, Darwinian gradualism. But it's not the only way an animal can evolve. So we'll talk about some of those differences as we go through the next couple of lectures. All right. So that's the end of what I got to talk about. Oh, perfect timing.